Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. As always, it's fantastic to have you all here for the CSAE webinar. You see the basic house rules on the screen. We're going to ask Zaki to speak for about 40-45 minutes. We'll have 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. We'd love to have questions and discussion throughout as well. So if you have a question or a comment, please use the raise your hand function or just type in the Q&A. Zaki's going to flag for us when he's reached some natural pause points, and then I'll call on anyone who has questions. Very keen to try to have an open discussion, as I say. Thank you so much, Zaki, for joining us. It's a privilege to have you back at CSAE, even if in this new virtual world. Zaki's going to be presenting today on the title you see there, Can Child Marriage Law Change Attitudes and Behaviour? Experimental Evidence from an Information Intervention in Bangladesh. Over to you, Zaki.
Okay, so thanks very much, Simon, for organizing this, and thanks everyone for attending. So this is joint work with Amrit Amarapu, my colleague at the University of Kent, and Amrit, I think, has joined as well, and Niaz Asadullah, who's at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. This is a paper about child marriage, which we define as marriage below the age of 18 years. And female child marriage or female early marriage is very widespread in developing countries. According to the latest measures, about 1 in 3 women in developing countries today marry below the age of 18. And there's a growing literature which documents the adverse effects of female early marriage on a variety of different outcomes. For example, it adversely affects their schooling, and that's a work by Field and Ambrose. There's more recent evidence that it adversely affects the human capital development of the next generation, the education and health of their children. There are adverse effects on a variety of different dimensions, including, so in a recent study with Niaz and myself, we find that it adversely affects the quality of their social networks for the women who marry, who experience child marriage. Now, most countries have a minimum age of marriage stipulated in the law. Although there are exceptions which are allowed, typically when there is permission from the court and parental consent. However, in developing countries in particular, the implementation of the law can be lax because formal institutions don't function very well. So it might be difficult to verify the age of brides. Law enforcement can be weak and so on. And what happens quite often is that the timing of marriage is dictated by social norms. So, for example, in South Asia, there are strong social pressures to marry from the onset of puberty. And so it's typically these social pressures and the onset of puberty which determines the age of marriage rather than the law. Now, recently, I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, there has been a renewed effort to stem the practice of female early marriage around the world, from national governments, international development agencies, and so on. And this has taken the form of programs for skill training for adolescent girls, community awareness programs, conditional cash transfers, and so on. And in a number of countries, they have introduced harsher punishments for underage marriage, or they have raised the minimum age of marriage. But the problem is that these are typically countries which there is weak law enforcement. And so there's a question of whether doing something around the legal age of marriage can have an effect on behavior when formal institutions are not very effective. Now, there are legal theorists who argue that the law can influence behavior not simply by the way that law enforcement is conducted, but in addition to that, by simply through what the law says. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of slides. But that is essentially the motivation for our research question, which is the following. Can a change in child marriage law affect social attitudes towards the practice and behavior around the practice in a setting where there is weak law enforcement? And if so, how does that happen? And in the literature, there has been discussion around a variety of different theoretical mechanisms through which the law can affect behavior in a setting with weak enforcement. The first of these is called the expressive effect, which has been widely discussed in the by legal theorists. And it's also been formalized recently by Benadu and Tirole in a model about the theoretical model about social norms and law. And that's essentially saying that the law sends a signal to individuals about what the society's values are. And if people want to conform to the society's values, then they would respond to that signal. The law has also been considered to be a kind of focal point for coordinating behavior, even if the law doesn't shape people's attitudes and beliefs. And this has been discussed most widely in the context of female genital cutting, first by the sociologist Jerry Mackey, and recently by Oriol Camilotti and Plateau. Then there's a theoretical model by Asimoglu and Jackson who talk about how the law can affect behavior through whistleblowing. So people can whistleblow on those who violate the law, and that can act as a kind of enforcement mechanism, even if there is weak formal enforcement. And then there was some work that I did with Aldeshif, Shara, and Plateau some time ago about the way in which customary authorities can behave strategically in response to the formal law. And customary authorities can have access to social sanctions within their communities, and through that mechanism, they can influence behavior. So what we do in this study is conduct an information intervention introduced through a video, which provides information about a new child marriage law in Bangladesh, which was passed in Parliament in March 2017. There was a period in which the law was in the books, but it hadn't been implemented yet because the government was in discussions with various stakeholders about how the law was going to be implemented. The implementation rules were introduced in November 2018. And prior to that period, we did this information intervention in June 2018. This intervention took the form of a short drama about an adolescent girl who gets married. And this drama is shown to study participants individually. And there are different versions of this drama, some which refer to the new law, and the control version, which only refers to the pre-2017 law. And then we randomize the introduction of this, we randomize intervention along two dimensions in terms of the video content, which is shown to specific households, and then in terms of who in the household is shown this video, whether it's only shown to mothers of adolescent girls, or whether it's also shown to the father or to family elders within the extended family. So let me just talk about the literature which has motivated our work and other work which addresses similar kinds of questions. So our research design is very strongly motivated by this study by Chen and Ye, who have a similar question. And what they do is that In the US, they have study participants transcribe court decisions around obscenity laws. And these court decisions can be conservative or they could be liberal. And what they find is that when study participants have been exposed to liberal decisions around obscenity laws, it increased their stated attitudes in the sense that they express more sexually liberal attitudes. And it increases their perception of the prevalence of the similar kind of behavior. But yet then you also find some backlash effects from this intervention. And then there's been a study by Vogt, Ahmed, Fer, and Efferson around female genital cutting in Sudan, where they show movies to different communities, which introduce various kinds of views on female genital cutting. And they find that this intervention increases acceptance of uncut girls in the communities which were exposed to these movies. And then Banerjee, La Ferrara, and Orozco have an intervention which is around HIV and AIDS, and so they show a drama in urban Nigeria where participants are exposed to this drama around HIV and AIDS. And what they find is that it affects attitudes and behavior around HIV. And then there's this well-known study by Burstein, Gonzalez, and Yanijizawa Drott, which is about female labor force participation in Saudi Arabia, where they provide information to men about perception about female labor force participation, well, actually, social acceptability of female labor force participation among men in the population. And then they study behavior around female labor force participation of the wives of those who were exposed to this information intervention, and they find that there is some effect on the labor market behavior. So we're doing something around along similar lines around child marriage. So let me say a bit about the context of the study. So we do this information intervention in Bangladesh, which is one of the highest rates of female early marriage in the world. According to recent estimates, about 60% of women in the age group 20 to 24 years marry before the age of 18. So that is below the legal age. And there's literature showing that the age of onset of puberty is a strong determinant of the age of marriage in Bangladesh. Now, until recently, the law around marriage age was the Child Marriage Restraint Act of 1929, which set the legal age of marriage for women at 18 years and 21 years for men. But the punishment for violating this law was very nominal. So it was 1 month imprisonment or a fine of 1,000 taka, which is $12 and 50 cents.
Zaki,
yes.
Before you go on, I actually have a clarifying question, but I can ask it now, or I can wait if you'd prefer.
Sure. Why don't you go ahead now? Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what specifically is prohibited here. For example, suppose that a young man and a young woman live together. Is that unlawful? Because I think in this country, for example, what's often prohibited is going through the ceremony of marriage. But if a couple lives together as if they're married, then the question is really about age of consent to sexual intercourse, but that's as distinct from prohibition on early marriage. And I'm just wondering, does that distinction matter, or put differently, when would Bangladeshi legislation treat a couple as having got married as opposed to just had some social informal ceremony and started living together?
So cohabitation is extremely rare, and there are in fact strong social taboos against premarital cohabitation and premarital
But put
sex.
differently, just to jump in, suppose that both the parents and the general community are all very supportive. They come together, they have a marriage celebration, but nobody brings out a document that gets signed. And then the couple starts living together as if they're husband and wife. Would that be captured as a marriage, potentially unlawful under this legislation? Or is the legislation really just penalizing somebody who goes through a formal process of agreeing a marriage contract?
So the law is about the formal marriage contract. The reason that that policymakers are not so concerned about premarital cohabitation is that there are very strong social restrictions around premarital cohabitation. It would be an issue in the sense that if you think that the reason that that this is a policy issue is around concerns about early childbirth, which carries health risks. The reason why in a country like Bangladesh, the focus is on official marriage itself, is because the other because that's the only way in which childbirth really occurs. So in a different setting, like in sub-Saharan Africa, the concern might be different, and the policies that you would be focused on would not necessarily be around marriage, but all forms of cohabitation. Yeah.
Well, thank
you. The new child marriage law came into effect and was passed into the law books in 2017, and it had two important components which makes it distinct from the previous law. There was actually no change in the legal age of marriage for men and women, but the punishment was increased from 1 month to 2 years for any adult who engaged in an early marriage or facilitated such a marriage. And the fine was increased 100-fold to 100,000 taka, which is over $1,000 for any adult who marries an underage person or facilitates such a marriage. But at the same time, there was a special clause introduced into the law which said that marriage below the age of 18 for women and below the age of 21 for men is not a punishable offense if the court rules that it's in the best interest of the child. And the clause itself actually does not provide any details about what those special circumstances are. And so it's quite vague about how it would actually be implemented, but it just says that if the court rules that it's in the interest of the child, then it would not be deemed a punishable offense. There was another dimension, another new element in the new law, which is that an underage boy or girl who marries would also face punishment, which was not part of the old law. But this is not an element that we use in our experimental design. So let me talk a bit about the intervention at this point. So we produced this short drama, which was about an adolescent girl who gets married. And we produced 3 different versions of this drama. These three versions are almost identical shot by shot, except that in 2 of the treatment versions of the video, there's reference to the new Child Marriage Act of 2017. In treatment 1, there's reference only to the harsher punishment in the new child marriage law, but not to the exception clause. And in treatment 2, there's reference to both the harsher punishment and the exception clause. Whereas in the control group, which is otherwise almost identical, there's only reference to the 1929 Child Marriage Registration Act. So these dramas they're available on YouTube, and so if you're interested, you can have a look at it. This is an image of a study participant who is being shown the drama on this digital tablet by the survey, by a survey enumerator. And these dramas were shown individually to the study participants, even though everyone in the same household who is included in the intervention sees the same version of the video. These are just some images from the drama itself. And so it starts with by introducing this adolescent girl, and then it says that she's married off, although she's 15 years old. And towards the end of the drama, there is this magistrate and some law enforcement authorities who come to the household of the groom, and there's some discussions around the underage marriage, and the father-in-law and the groom taken away by the law enforcement authorities at the end of the drama. I think let me just talk a bit about the sample at this point. So for this study, we started off with a sample which comes from a nationally representative survey of women in Bangladesh in 2014, in which we interviewed more than 6,000 women. And we used this survey from 2014 to construct the sample for the 2018 intervention, for which we drew 80 village clusters from a total of 391 village clusters for the 2014 study. We included all female respondents in these 80 village clusters. And then we also included anything between 0 and 2 additional respondents in these households for the study. And these additional household members were other people who live in the same household or members of the extended family who live in the vicinity. And they were 0, 1, or 2 additional participants, which is a number which is determined randomly. And these additional participants are either, could be the father-in-law, the mother-in-law, the eldest brother-in-law, and these individuals these relationships are chosen because these are typically individuals who have a strong say about the marriage of daughters within the same family. And what we do is essentially we go down this list till we reach till we hit the number X. If the father-in-law is available, then he's included. If he's not available, then we include the mother-in-law, and so on. Okay. So then what we do is immediately after we show this video during the interview, during the survey, we ask a series of questions about attitudes towards appropriate marriage age, appropriate age gap between the bride and the groom, beliefs about the attitudes of others within the community. We show some vignettes to the study participants, vignettes about early marriage, and then we ask some questions around the vignettes. We also conducted some implicit association tests, which we adapted to the context of early marriage. And then at the end of the interview, we gave a token gift of $2.50 to the study participants, and we asked them whether they would like to contribute any portion of this gift to an NGO which does work around early marriage, and specifically they engage in counseling of families when an underage marriage is being planned, and they resort to whistleblowing to law enforcement authorities as a last resort if an underage marriage is about to take place. And then 5 months and 10 months after the intervention, we conducted telephone interviews with the mothers of adolescent girls to collect information on whether any of these adolescent girls had since been married or whether any marriage steps had been taken whether marriage offers have been received and what response have been given to these marriage offers. Okay, so at this point, I think I can pause, Simon, and if there are any questions about the study design.
I have one quick clarification. I don't think I see any other questions at the moment, but please all jump in. Just to clarify, so the 2017 legislation at the time of the experiment was on the books, but was not the law of Bangladesh, as I understand.
That's right.
And the question is very simple. Was that fact made clear in the videos that referred to the legislation?
No. So what was mentioned is that such a law had been passed in Parliament in 2017, but we did not provide any details about the implementation of the law, in part because it was actually quite unclear about what was actually happening at that time, what the government was, what steps the government was taken. What has been clearer later on is that the government was in this consultation process with stakeholders, and that's why no directives have been provided to courts about how the law should be implemented.
No, that's fine.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Let
me ask Claire has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I may have missed this, but can you tell us why you're informing primarily the women? Is it because the moms are typically the most important decision maker about when their daughter gets married?
So the primary respondent in the study is a woman, and that's because the earlier survey from 2014 was it only had female respondents. So that's why we take them as our primary respondents. But then we add these additional respondents who live in the same household as a primary respondent. And that could be a man or it could be a woman. And those additional respondents we chose on the basis of who culturally is important in informing, in influencing the decision regarding marriage timing and marriage partners and so on. So in fact, the mother typically has quite a limited say in these marriage decisions, especially in a setting where there are where there's an extended family living together. So typically, the father-in-law would have a very important say. So the grandfather of the adolescent, then the mother-in-law, then uncles, and in fact, the husband, the father, is much lower in this hierarchy. If there's an extended family living together.
Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And Zaki, about 20 minutes remaining, if that's right.
Okay, that's great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so at this point, I can show some summary statistics from the baseline intervention in 2018. So first, what this table shows is balance across these different characteristics in the control group and treatment 1 and treatment 2. And what you can see is that these characteristics seem to be fairly balanced across these 3 treatment control groups. But I'd also like to highlight how when we asked respondents about the minimum age of marriage, most of them seem to know that it was 18 years for girls, and this is before the intervention. Most of them can also say broadly what is the punishment for violating the minimum age law. So they can say that the adult can be imprisoned and that the adult can be fined. There's very little knowledge about the exception clause. So it's about only about 8 or 9% who can say vaguely that there's some sort of exception. Only 5 respondents were able to name the exceptions clause specifically. And so therefore we know that at the time of the intervention, people seem to have very good knowledge about the pre-existing, about the previous law, but there was very little knowledge about the new elements of the new law. Okay. So then what
Zaki, just before you go on, I see Julian has a question, and Claire, you don't have another question, do you? You can, right, Julian.
Thanks. Just out of curiosity, do you see the norms as being very, very clustered? Like, the knowledge and kind of the respect for the rules? Is it you have some villages where everybody does it, and some villages where nobody does it, or it just kind of seems to be randomly allocated across? Because if we think of it as a social norm, then we should see potentially.
Right. Okay. So there is regional variation in the prevalence of early marriage in Bangladesh. So there are some pockets where there's much higher prevalence, but those are typically in more impoverished parts of the country. We haven't really looked systematically where there are villages or communities where there is much higher prevalence than in other communities. My sense is that the variation is not at the level of communities, but the variation is more across regions. And then there is a big rural-urban divide. So the prevalence is much higher in rural areas than urban areas. Yeah. But I think more can be done around looking at, whether there is some clustering going on at the community level. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to show next are some regression results about what we see with the short-term attitudinal outcomes, as well as the longer-term outcomes around child marriage behavior. And I'm going to show you these regressions where we introduce village dummies, and we introduce individual level controls. But we get very similar results if we just do a comparison of means, or we do regressions without these individual level controls. So first, let me show you this regression table, which is about where the outcomes are about attitudes towards early marriage, responses to questions asked immediately after the video intervention. And you can see that for the first treatment, where participants are told about the harsher punishments, but not about the exceptions clause, we don't see anything, no significant effects and no large effects. For the second treatment, where they're told both about harsher punishments and about the exceptions clause, we see that the appropriate marriage age that is reported by the respondents is slightly lower by about 0.2 years, whereas we don't see an effect for the other outcomes. If we look at respondents, what the respondents say about about what they think is the appropriate age of marriage that others in the village should report, or whether they think, or whether they believe parents in the village expect their daughters to marry before the age of 18, or whether people think worse of those who marry after reaching the age of 18. Again, for treatment 1, we don't see anything. For treatment 2, we only see an effect that people are less likely to think worse of those who marry after the age of 18, which may not be what we would expect, given that this is why they're being told about the exceptions clause. We have this measure, which is about, which is an index which measures alignment of views with traditional gender norms. And this index is based on responses to questions along the lines, based on whether respondents agree to statements along the lines that boys need more nutrition to quit than girls, that education is more important for boys than for girls. And higher values of this index indicate that their views are more aligned with traditional gender norms and with some sort of gender bias. Here we see that the first treatment reduces alignment with traditional gender norms for this measure. We don't see anything for the second treatment. Then we looked at the responses to questions around the vignettes. At this point, I can just show you a sample vignette just to give you a sense of what these questions were like. And so these vignettes have this story that an underage girl receives a marriage proposal. There's some description around the context about who the groom is and what her family situation is. And the vignette related questions along the lines that what would you do if you were with this girl's parents? What do you think that most other parents in the village would do? What do you think other parents would advise in the same situation? And we have a number of different vignettes, but what we see is that we don't really see an effect from either of these two treatments on these vignette-related questions. When we ask about financial contributions at the end of the interview, financial contributions to the charity, there we see a big effect from treatment 1. So this amount is about 25% of the contribution that they made in the control group. So it's quite a big jump in contributions, whereas for the second treatment where participants are told about exceptions clause, then we don't see an effect on contributions. If anything, there's a slight negative effect. So those are the effects that we see for the short-term outcomes. Essentially, we're not seeing very much, except in the case of these financial contributions. However, when we go to the longer-term outcomes related to actual marriage-related decisions, then we see quite a different picture. But it is an unexpected picture in the sense that we find that the first treatment where participants are told about the harsher punishments in the new law, it actually seems to increase the probability of marriage among adolescents. So I should mention that here, unit of observation is an unmarried adolescent girl. And the treatment is saying what is the treatment that the mother has been provided. And we see that it has a 7.2 percentage point increase in likelihood of being married in 5 months after the intervention. An increase in the likelihood of receiving a marriage offer, conditional on receiving a marriage offer, an increase in the likelihood of accepting the offer. And we also see an increase in the likelihood of any marriage-related steps, which includes marriages, engagement, as well as active groom search by the adolescent girl's family. We also look at these outcomes 10 months after the intervention. So we repeat this analysis 10 months after the intervention, and we see that these effects persist. So there is still a positive risk of marriage from exposure to the first treatment, a higher likelihood of any steps towards marriage from the first treatment. For the second treatment, we don't see any of these effects, except that the adolescent girl is more likely to receive an offer of marriage, but no change along the other dimensions. Okay, so let me just summarize now that what we're finding is that for the short-term attitudinal outcomes, which relate to questions which were asked immediately after the intervention, we're not seeing very much except for the effects on financial contributions. And yet, when we do these telephone surveys 5 months and 10 months after the intervention, we see an acceleration in steps towards a marriage of adolescent girls, even though the law is about and we see this specifically for the treatment where they're informed about the harsher punishments in the new law. And so we see this counterintuitive effect. And so we have done some thinking and some analysis around trying to explain what is happening. And on this slide, I have 3 possible explanations, which are not necessarily complete and not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is that it's possible that what the respondents are reporting in terms of their attitudes and beliefs do not represent their true beliefs regarding early marriage. And it can be that the treatments are affecting beliefs in ways which we have not managed to capture in terms of our short-term attitudinal questions. It could also be that the treatments have differential impacts on beliefs and attitudes on different household members. And some of these household members are more influential in the marriage decisions of adolescent girls than others. So I'm going to show you some results which potentially provide some insights regarding each of these hypotheses. Here are some regression estimates where we run a regression on the actual marriage outcomes on the short-term attitudinal responses. And what this shows is that there is a correlation between the stated appropriate age of marriage and the actual marriage outcomes. And these correlations go in the direction that you would expect, in the sense that if they reported a higher appropriate age of marriage, then they're less likely to take any steps towards marriage for adolescent girls 5 months down the line. They're less likely to accept an offer of marriage 5 months down the line. And this second variable over here indicates that they mentioned the law when they were asked to justify why they had stated a particular appropriate age of marriage. And what these estimates are telling us is that if they've mentioned the law as a reason for stating a specific appropriate age of marriage, then they're less likely to take any marriage steps for adolescent girls for the 5-month period. We see similar patterns and I would say stronger correlations when we do this for the outcomes after 10 months. So the correlations between the short-term attitudinal responses and the longer-term outcomes go in the right direction. So then what I'm going to show you, I'm just going to skip these slides, and I'm going to show you some analysis around heterogeneity, where we are interacting the treatment for these regressions with the actual marriage outcomes, with an indicator for whether the father or a family elder was also provided the intervention. Now, the information intervention is always the same as that which is provided to the mother, but what the interaction terms are capturing is that an additional family member is also provided the same information. And then what we see is that with the treatment 1 coefficient, which now captures just the effect in the case where only mothers are informed, here we don't see much of an effect. So these effects are no longer statistically significant, and the coefficients are smaller, although they are still positive. It's only when we add the added effect from the other family members being informed that we see a positive effect. And although the interaction terms are statistically insignificant, when we add up the 2 coefficients for the first treatment, that's captured in these p-values reported over here, and then we see a significant effect, an acceleration in marriage, an acceleration in any marriage steps. The picture is slightly clearer when we do this for the 10-month outcomes, but they go in the same direction. And so the picture we're getting over here is that when only the mothers are informed, we don't really see this acceleration in marriage steps, but we do see this acceleration when the family and elders or the father is also informed. If there are any questions about the these results, I can pause at this point. And
I've actually got a couple of questions about results, but maybe we'll let you finish first if it's okay, Zaki, maybe
sure.
in the next 1 or 2 minutes.
Okay. What do these results tell us? Well, one of the implications is that what we're finding is that there isn't information sharing within the family unit, because if there was information sharing, it wouldn't matter who in the household you gave this information about the new law. They would share it among themselves, and you would see the same kind of behavior regarding marriage practices. But that isn't happening. The outcomes depend on whether the mother has been informed or whether other family members have been informed. And so what this also implies is that the preferences of the mother regarding the marriage timing of her daughters are not aligned with those of the other family members. And then what we can say is that we are observing this backlash effect from informing individuals and households about the new law. These theories that I discussed earlier, they all include the potential for a backlash effect. And we go through them one by one in the paper to see whether those kinds of mechanisms can be operational here. And what we conclude is that the kind of backlash effects that are being highlighted in these theoretical models can't really be in operation in our case because they're not consistent with the other effects that we're getting. I'm not going to go into those explanations in the interest of time, but what we propose as a potential explanation is that what may be driving this backlash is the perception that the law is going to come into effect and is going to be enforced in the future. And this acceleration in early marriages of adolescent girls is taking place before the law enforcement comes into effect. That could be something which can explain the acceleration in early marriages that we are observing. Along similar lines, it could be that there's a perception that the state is going to become more supportive of the agency of adolescent girls. But this is something which is happening when we inform them about the new child marriage law, and that again could explain the kind of behavior that we're observing. We don't have direct evidence for these hypotheses, but it's consistent with the fact that we don't observe these acceleration in early marriages in the second treatment, where participants are also informed about the special clause, and then it doesn't seem like the law is, then the law seems to be more lax when participants are also informed about the special clause. And additionally, we don't see this backlash effect when mothers are informed. So let me pause there and take those questions. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Zaki. So we've got about 7 minutes for questions. I've got 2 questions to start, and let me encourage people to jump in if they have others. Let me first go to Delilah Figueiredo from the EU Institute with a question about the vignette questions. So Delilah, can we hear you? Are you unmuted? Okay, sorry about this. Let me just read out the question. Let me read out the question, Zaki, as I have it, which is, do girls also respond to the vignette questions or just the mothers? And if the girls do you ever ask them to put themselves in the role of that girl bride?
Okay, so I think that's an interesting thing to do. We didn't do that because there are additional research ethics issues if we were to ask questions directly of adolescent girls. So we didn't do this for this intervention, but that's something that we could potentially do in the future. Great,
thank you. And Julien, I think you had a question.
Yeah, quick. Thanks, it was really interesting. I'm sorry, my connection dropped at some point, so maybe you've talked about this and I missed it, but there was a bit of the sample size seemed to change quite a bit from your original survey and your follow-up surveys.
Yeah.
And one thing that would be interesting is could you tell us a bit more about attrition, and if you think some of the results might just be due to kind of sample composition issues, changes that are like affected by the treatment?
Sure.
Because I mean, in a sense, the results are quite
yeah.
striking that the treatment have increased marriage, and so we just want to make sure that it's not just a sample composition issue.
The sample for the telephone survey outcomes is smaller because those questions are only asked in the case of households where there were unmarried adolescent girls. And so there were a lot fewer households which had unmarried adolescent girls. And so we only conducted the telephone interviews with those households. And so we do a balance test for the smaller sample, which I didn't show you, but I have it over here. So you can see that we also have this balance across these different variables for the smaller sample, for the telephone survey sample. We did have attrition for the telephone survey sample. I think it was 12% for the first round of the telephone survey, 19% for the second round. But that really doesn't affect things very much. I mean, so we do balance tests for the post attrition, and that still looks quite balanced. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I see a question from Claire.
Yeah, thanks. I may have missed this, but you said you were going to do IATs. Did you show us the IAT results?
No, I haven't, because we are still analyzing that data.
Okay.
It is a bit problematic because a lot of our respondents were elderly, and they were, they didn't do very well on the IATs, and we have to think about how to deal with that.
Yeah, they're hard.
We haven't done that analysis properly yet. No.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Claire. We have a question now from Farah Saeed at the Lahore School of Economics.
Thank you, Zaki. That was very interesting. I just have one question about the, so I saw earlier on you showed that from treatment 2, people who think that the age is appropriate decreases before 18, right? And then at the same time, they also think that villagers are less likely to think that marriage after 18 is something bad. So does that indicate that they're more affected by what the household thinks rather than what the community thinks? Because I mean, at the end you also show that the marriage before 18 is also increasing. So it seems that the household is more concerned about the household member itself and not so much concerned about what the community might be thinking. And I'm wondering if you have any data that can shed light on that.
Okay, so you're saying that they're more concerned about what the household is thinking because once they've been exposed to the intervention, they are stating a lower appropriate age of marriage. So what you're thinking is that that's driven by what they think household members would be thinking. Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah, so more what the household thinks and less what the community thinks, because the community, they also don't think marriage after 18 is bad necessarily, and yet they would rather get married earlier or get their girls married earlier. So it's not that the community is putting any pressure on them. It seems to be more what the household thinks.
I see. So I think that's a good argument. I think that's a good point. I think that's one possible interpretation. The way that we were interpreting it is that if there is the special clause which indicates that the lawmakers think that under certain circumstances marriage below the age of 18 is socially acceptable, then they are more willing to express their own views about the social about the appropriateness of early marriage, or they have updated their views about whether early marriage is appropriate or not. As to why they now believe that other members of the community would find after 18 marriage more acceptable, that has been a bit of a puzzle for us. I don't have a good explanation for that. I think that's a bit counterintuitive. But I mean, yeah. So if you have an explanation for that, I think that would be interesting.
Thanks, Zaki. And maybe let me encourage you guys to
Sure.
email about that, if that's all right.
Sure.
We're out of time. Let me grab the opportunity to thank Zaki again for a really interesting presentation, and also to Amrit for joining us as a co-author today. Thanks everyone for joining in, for your questions. Please, as always, have a great week. Stay tuned to the CSAE Twitter feed. Next week, we'll be hosting Chris Blattman. I believe that's a 3 p.m. start, but we'll advertise the details as usual. So thank you, everyone, and we'll look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you to everyone for joining in.
Thanks, Zaki.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zaki.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.